Ranjana Jaya Brajajana Ranjana Jaya Jamunatira Vanachari Jaya Kunja Vihari Jaya Jamunatira Vanachari Jaya Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopijana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Shri Shri Radha Madhava Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasa Tato Jayamudhirayet Nashta Prayeshva Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavatirutamashluke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki. So on the board we have 322.8. 322.8. Is it the right verse?
I think we had it already.
Then we have no verse on the board. Okay, text 9. So, ich lese einfach den Vers, Sanskrit. So, English, German, I think we can speak English, huh? You speak English better? So, we'll do English lecture today. We're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 22, The Marriage of Kardama Muni and Devahuti, Text 9. Priya vrato tanapadho swase yang duhita mama anvichati patim yuktam vayakshi lagunadibhi. Translation. My daughter is the sister of Priyavrata and Uttanapada. She is seeking a suitable husband in terms of age, character, and good qualities. Purport. The grown-up daughter of Swayambhuva Manu, Devahuti, had good character and was well qualified. Therefore, she was searching for a suitable husband just befitting her age, qualities, and character. The purpose of Manu's introducing his daughter as the sister of Priyavrata and Uttanapada, two great kings, was to convince the sage that the girl came from a great family. She was his daughter and at the same time the sister of Kshatriyas. She did not come from a lower class family. Manu therefore offered her to Kardama Muni as just suitable for his purpose. It is clear that although the daughter was mature in age and qualities, she did not go out and find her husband independently. She expressed her desire for a suitable husband corresponding to her character, age, and quality, and the father himself, out of affection for his daughter, took charge of finding such a husband. Om Agyanat Mirandasya Ginanjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swaparantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shriyuta Parakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashatya Deshatarine Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Tinamini Shri Varsha Vanavadividi Daitaya Kripabdaye Krishna Sambandha Vijnanadayane Prabhave Namaha Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vyaivacha Patitanam Pavanevyo Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha Panchatatvatmakam Krishnam Bhaktarupa Swarupakam Bhaktavataram Bhaktakyam Namami Bhakta Shaktikam Sankarshana Karanato Yashai Garbhodashai Chapayobdishai Sheshasha Kalasa Nityanandakya Rama Sharanam Mamastu Namo Mahavaranjaya Krishna Prema Padayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namni Ghora Tvise Namaha Namaste Halagraha, Namaste Mushlayuda, Namaste Rivatikanta, Namaste Bhaktavatsala, Namaste Dharanidhara, Namaste Balam Shrishta, Pralambare, Namaste Stui, Mam Krishna Purvaja, He Krishna Karuna Sindhu, Dinabandho Jagatpate, Gopesha Gopivakanta, Radhakanta, Namastate, Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi, Radhe Vrindavaneshwari, Vrishavanu Sutadevi Pranamami Hari Priye Jayatam Surato Pangor Mamanda Matergati Matsarvasva Padam Vajo Radhamadana Mohano Divyad Vrindaranya Kalpadrumada Srimad Radangara Simhasanasto Srimad Radha Srila Govinda Deva Uprishthalivi Sayomana Smarami Srimandra Sarasaramvi Vamsivata Tadastitaha Karsham Venu Swanai Gopir Gopinata Shriyastunaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Garadhara Srivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Again the verse. Priyavrato Tanapadaho Svasayam Duhita Mama Anvichati Patim Yuktam Vayakshila Gunadibihi. Übersetzung. My daughter is the sister of Priyavrata and Uttanapada. She is seeking a suitable husband in terms of age, character, and good qualities. So we'll continue reading from Manu. First, Manu was talking to Kardama Muni about how Brahmanas and Kshatriyas should cooperate. He felt very blessed that this great sage, Brahmin sage, was able to was capable and able to take care of his daughter, but also he felt blessed as a Kshatriya to have the association of a Brahmin. Traditionally, the idea was that actually Brahmins and Kshatriyas cooperate in such a way to lead society properly. Brahmins are considered to be the brain or the head, or we also heard in the last few days the heart of the social body. So we have there's so-called Varna Purusha. Varna Purusha is the social body, and this Varna Purusha has as its head the Brahmins. But not only the head, in the last days we heard also the heart. So the heart, sometimes the heart, the head, the mind, is clumped into one section, because many people cannot really distinguish what is the difference between the mind and the heart. What is the difference between the mind and the heart? So we're not talking about the physical heart, but what's on your mind, it's also in your heart. So there is a direct connection between the mind and the heart. You cannot really separate it, and that's why it's sometimes a little bit complicated when sometimes people have this idea to just follow your heart. So, but if you just follow your heart, are you truly following, what's really leading to a higher purpose, or is it just the mind? So the heart and the mind is sometimes difficult to really understand. Is it truly my best interest? What's really my core necessity or intuition, positive intuition? Or is it a whim of the mind? Is it a whim of the mind, some sentiment, some sensation, some feeling, some thought, some desire that has become so prominent in the mind that we have this very strong desire, very strong feeling. And so therefore, it is generally always recommended that we should not just blindly trust our heart, because it might very well be our mind, it might very well be our mind playing a trick on us, and misleading us. So it's always good to seek advice, to use the intellect, to question yourself, to introspect, to ask friends, to ask people you trust, elders. Often it's recommended to ask 7 Brahmins if you want to take a big decision. So why asking the Brahmins? Because the Brahmins, they're qualified by their character. Their character qualities, their lifestyle in purity and simplicity gives them a very clear mind and pure heart. So even Brahmins are technically superior to Kshatriyas. Externally, they might look very much like very poor, very simple, very maybe even uncivilized, some Brahmins. So like in this case also, we have here Kardama Muni. He was a real sadhu, a real sadhu who was living in the forest, in the jungle, He had long matted hairs, very long matted hairs. He was wearing very simple cloth, he had a very simple thatched hut. And he was so absorbed in his meditation and spiritual practice that he wasn't even taking care of his external body, So, externally, what is, the big difference between, somebody who's crazy and, it's not taking care of their body, it's not clean, Sometimes you would also see, crazy people also tend to have, matted hair, torn cloths, It's almost the same characteristics, somebody who's crazy and a sadhu, a muni, But there's a big difference, there's a big difference. And we heard in the previous chapter the description that the sage, he looked like a jewel that wasn't polished yet, So when you see a jewel, you can see its intrinsic, effulgence, and value. But this jewel might still be, if you just take it out of the earth, it might be covered, with dirt, or like some, vegetables from the garden, when you just get them out of the garden, they're full of earth, but then you wash them and then they become beautiful. So in the same way, the sage, Kardama Muni, actually was doing this not out of ignorance, but actually he was voluntarily detaching from this material reality. So this is one of the main qualifications or differences between the Kshatriya and the Brahmin. The Kshatriyas and the Brahmins actually receive the same fundamental education. Kshatriyas and Brahmins, very often you will hear in different traditional texts, the priests, the teachers of society, the Brahmins, and also the Kshatriyas, the children of royal families, or landlords, they would have the same education. They would be together in Gurukul. In Gurukul they would get the same training, the same fundamental training. And sometimes some Kshatriya boys, became more Brahminical inclined. But generally speaking, after their education is finished, the Kshatriyas would become very much involved in society. So Kshatriyas, the politicians, the kings, they would become, of course, involved in administration, in warfare also, in diplomacy, and tax collection, general management of society, which can be very burdensome and stressful, and it's naturally in the mode of passion, So whereas the Brahmin, he would remain and continue the lifestyle they had in Gurukul, So the Gurukula lifestyle, the education in the Guru's house, literally speaking, Gurukula, is a Brahminical education. And the idea was that the kings should at least have the same foundation education, so when they later on become in charge and have a position of power and have to take decisions, they can be easily informed and directed by the Brahmins. So even the king might be distracted from the ideal, you could say, lifestyle and character and behavior. The king can easily be reminded of those ideals that he had as a young brahmachari student. And that also applies to our general education we have in our society. That's why the idea is to have, if you have a good foundation as a brahmachari, even if you join a little bit later, if you spend 3-4 years truly living like a brahmachari, that gives you a very strong foundation for the rest of your life. So even later on, you're married, you're working, you're distracted, you might, the standards might decrease. You have a reference for what is the ideal. Or generally you could say, the higher you set the standards in your educational time, the higher also you will end up when you reduce. You understand? If you have a really high standard as a brahmachari, really high standard. So when you reduce, because at one point there is, you have to be honest what your capacities, what your needs are, what your ambitions are, and then you reduce. But if your standards already as a brahmachari were not very high, then it's very likely you will go pretty deep. So that's the same idea with kshatriyas. The idea was that the kshatriyas should have, very high Brahminical education, and when they go down into the position of, administration power, they would still have a very good, you could say, relationship with the ideal. Another aspect is also that ideally an emperor, a king, should be not just a king, he should be a brahmana rishi, or Raja Rishi, Raja Rishi. Or you could say a wise king, And this idea also exists to some extent in the West. There were some kings that were famed to be, to have been quite, even they have a lot of power, absolute power, they still were, they use this power for the benefit of the people. There are some kings like that, who were very just, in their dealings, very appropriate. Solomon, is supposed to have been such a king, for example. But in the Vedic texts, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, especially Mahabharata, we hear about a host of such great kings. You could basically say that out of the Bhagavatam, there were a few cases of kings who, were very, where you could say negative examples. But most kings that are described here in the Bhagavatam were actually kings who were Raja Rishis. So Raja means a king, and a Rishi means a sage, a sadhu. So in the story of the Bhagavad Gita, we have, of course, Arjuna, and then we have especially Yudhisthira. So we have the 5 Pandavas, who are the best friends of Krishna. And those 5 Pandavas, along with Krishna, are the main protagonists of the entire Mahabharata story. And each one of those 5 Pandavas has a different character, a different quality, a different inclination. And you could say Arjuna, he was just cool, Arjuna was cool, he was a musician, he could dance, he was the best friend of Krishna, he was the most powerful archer, he was kind of, you could say, transcendental, he was just cool. But then Bhima, he was not so cool, he was very kshatriya. So he was the archetype kshatriya, very easily enraged, very angry, clear cut, no nonsense, He was ready to, act upon, any injustice straight away with severe, with severity, So there was Bhima, When Bhima saw an injustice, he didn't care about, some formalities or, he was just, ready to act, And then we have Yudhisthira. And Yudhisthira was the perfect Raja Rishi, And it's very interesting, this relationship between those 3, because Yudhisthira, if you know the story about the 5 Pandavas, they were, princely kings, and they were sent into an exile. They were sent to exile for 12 years, into exile, by very, unfair means, horrible humiliation. So Bhima was, we should just, revenge. It's clear it was unfair, so we should just take revenge. Because they were sent to the forest. So Yudhisthira, he was actually happy, it says, Yudhisthira, it's like, oh, nice, we can go in the forest for 12 years, we can meditate, we can meet so many great sages and rishis, no diplomacy, no city life, perfect. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a few places in the Mahabharata where it becomes very clear that actually he was happy he was more happy in in the association of rishis and sages, in the forest, than he was when he was, had to deal with all the diplomacy and, conflicts, of royal life, political life. So, and in this connection, Srila Prabhupada describes that that's the ideal king, An ideal rishi, an ideal Raja Rishi, an ideal king is a king who actually would prefer to live the life of a Brahmin. But out of his duty and because it's his dharma, he performs the role of a kshatriya, a king. That's the ideal position actually. Nrsimhadeva Bhagavan ki jai. So that's actually the ideal position. If we have a king who is not really attached to the position of being a king, that would be the ideal situation. A king who doesn't want to really be king, who actually his main, you could say, source of inspiration is not power, might, weapons, influence, or just the veneration, the admiration that you get if you're in a position of power, but actually somebody who actually is truly detached and actually prefers the life of a Brahmin. Why? Because Brahmins, they live actually very simple lives, and their main source of power is not money, or weapons, or labor. So, because each one of the four varnas in the Varna Ashrama system, we have the Varna Ashrama system, and many people misunderstand it, nowadays, the Varna Ashrama system, because it's considered to be, especially in the West, the caste system, it's extremely unfair, it's, horrible, there's so many articles about, how horrible the caste system is. And there are, of course, many social, you could say, tumors, in the modern version of the Varnashrama system. But the original idea that you find in the traditional texts, and also how many sections, many areas of India, how they have managed to survive, even without proper leadership, even without saintly kings, and or even without or with a lot of destruction, with a lot of foreign rule. One of the reasons why India is still India is because of the Varnashrama system, because it's a it's a self-propelling system in many ways. So this system the idea was that power should be divided in society. Power should be divided in society. So there are four main sources of power, and which are connected to those four social divisions. So the Brahmins, they derive their power from knowledge. So I just said it, knowledge, from knowledge. Yeah, it's related. Knowledge is their main source of power. They have knowledge, they study. So if you have knowledge, you have power. Then the Kshatriyas derive their power from weapons, their military, their power, their might, weapons is another source of power. And then another source of power is money. So the Vaishyas, the traders, the bankers, they derive their power from money. And finally the workers, they get their power from labor. So this is very clear. So for example, when workers want to assert their power, they say, okay, we don't work. And they go on strike, and everybody's like, oh my God, no trains, no buses, everything locked, everything crashes, So that's their source of power, working, their labor, their work, they do so much. So if they don't work, big problem. And Vaishyas control money, so that's pretty obvious, how money, is power. But the idea was that no one should monopolize all four of them. So there should be this distribution. So the Kshatriyas, to some extent, of course, monopolized, more than the others, maybe to some extent. Because as a king you have, weapons, but you also have the ability to collect taxes, so you have money, you might have land, So in one sense, the king, had, some leverage. If he was, materialistic, he could misuse this position of power. And that's why the idea was that an ideal king should have the ability should always actually have the ministry or the council of Brahmins. That was always the position. So a king that did not take the advice of the Brahmins, or a king that did not have a guru, sitting next to him, in his assembly, was technically not really a true kshatriya, a true king. And you will see that from all the traditional descriptions, even until more or less recent times. There were a few examples in the 16th century, in southern India, in Hampi, the Vijayavada Empire, huge empire, and they, Krishna Raja, very famous king, very just, very, amazing, it's created so much prosperity for society and educated people and built big cities, and was a very powerful king, and he respected, the Vedic traditions, the Brahmins, cooperated with them properly, and also had a spiritual master. But also in all the traditional scriptures, you will see that the king had always, a Brahmin, either as a counselor or a few Brahmins, ministers, or even the spiritual master always there. So that's very good. Imagine you are the king, and you have your spiritual master sitting next to you. So you're naturally humble, You're naturally, going to, whenever you perform something, you take first the blessings of your guru, and, if you think twice before taking a bad decision, because the spiritual master is watching what you're doing. So that's that combination, a pure character of a king, with the extra support of the Brahmins, the priests, the intellectual class, made for a very ideal situation, and that's the ideal Srila Prabhupada, is describing again and again and again and again. And even, of course, we know that this ideal situation has been in decay since around 5,000 years. That's the description we get from the Srimad Bhagavatam. In the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we hear how Shringi, who was a Brahmin boy, misused his power. He misused his power, his Brahminical tejas, Brahmana tejas. Somebody who's really, du heißt tejas, Weißt du, was tejas heißt? What does tejas mean? Huh? Yeah, Brahminical power. Tejas, Tejas is very strong. The tejas, the Brahmana tejas, it comes from the purity of lifestyle, the deep realizations that somebody has. Then you have some tejas, Shakti, power, and these Brahmins had the ability to, control the elements. They had the ability to, influence matter, and even externally, he is the emperor Manu. Manu, he was the emperor. He's kind of like a universal emperor. He's bowing down, to this, yogi sitting in the forest, looking dirty, living in a very simple hut, So why is the emperor, bowing down to this person? Because he could perceive his Brahmana tejas. It was obvious that this person was extremely qualified, by his renunciation, by his knowledge, study, and practice. The application of knowledge. So yes, this Varna Purusha, the social body, is a situation where all the different parts of this social body are in good balance. So we focus mainly now on the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas, but I'll talk a little bit about the Vaishyas as well. Because nowadays our society is strongly controlled by the Vaishya class. is very obvious. Money rules the world. Money rules the world. Capitalism has triumphed. As capitalism is the system that has become more predominant. In most countries, in most places. So that means that money is controlling the world. That means that the Vaishya class is controlling everything. So whoever is controlling the society, it creates an imbalance, in a certain direction. So if you imagine the body to be a reflection of society, and the legs, they are considered to be the Shudras, the working class, the artists, the musicians, architects, etc., performers, actors. Then you have the belly of society, which is the Vaishyas, and then the chest and the arms are the Kshatriyas, and the heart and the head, are the Brahmins. So in a similar way, like a healthy body is in balance and cooperates with each other, in a similar way, this Varna, Purusha body, this societal body should cooperate. So ideally you have, a very sober head, a pure heart, guiding your existence. So that would be the role of the Brahmins, informed by Vedic texts, by Vedic knowledge, purified by sadhana and practice, they guide society. And then we have the Kshatriyas that are connected to the heart, of the Brahmins, and they are in direct cooperation, and they act upon this, so they are very strong, they should be strong, powerful, charitable, generous, and that's how they protect society, guide society, engage society, sometimes also militarily, they have to protect society. That's their duty. And then we have the Vaishyas. So the Vaishyas, they are the belly, So the belly should not be too big, but also not too thin, So if the belly becomes too big, it's generally a sign of imbalance and you're becoming unhealthy, So if too much power and wealth is accumulated in the belly of society, that creates, it's an unhealthy body, Just like you would see somebody who has too much a bloated belly, too much beer, or too much stress, Something is, out of balance. So in a similar way, the Kshatriyas had the duty and right to tax the Vaishyas, So the Vaishyas were taxed, so that the wealth was redistributed in society, The Kshatriyas, were allowed and had the duty to tax the Vaishyas, and with their duty to give charity, they would redistribute this in whatever situation it was needed. So traditionally this was done during temple ceremonies or festivals or yagyas. As part of the yagyas, if you read different descriptions, no yagya, no ceremony is complete if there is no charity, or donations. Not just for the Brahmins, but actually there should be donations for all sections of society, So, and there are some Indian films, old Indian films. What is the thing? Surya Vamsi, I think it's called, no? Surya Vamsi, Kshatriya family, and they're standing there in front of their house and they're giving, cloth and pots to the people. So this is kind of like a modern depiction to some extent. But yeah, you will hear how in such yagya ceremonies, the kings would distribute land, they would distribute animals, they would distribute, give people the ability to become, if there, for some reason there was some lack, they were replenished to become independent. If you get some land and some animals, you have the ability to sustain yourself, and they would also sometimes, gift fabrics and metals, pots, etc. So that was the position of the Kshatriyas. They were to rebalance power, make sure everyone fulfills their duty. The Vaishyas' main duty is agriculture, cow protection, but also trade. So their main duty was supposed to be, providing society with food, for the belly, but they were also trading, with all kind of other, you could say, luxury items, other items that are, also required, more seldom, more expensive. But by this activity, naturally, wealth will overaccumulate in that section. So that's why the kings were allowed to tax them, to rebalance the situation. And many people don't like to hear that. It sounds almost like socialism, The state is taking the money away from the Vaishyas, But actually it's required, Otherwise, like nowadays, usually 1% of the world population, has more money than the weakest 40%, So I forgot exactly how many they are, this 1%, but it's very small. And they have more money than the next 3 billion people, So that's an imbalance, It's only a question of time until, something goes, topsy-turvy. There's some revolution or some, so this gap between the wealthy and the poor, keeps spreading. Even in Germany is more or less, well off. Still, this gap, it's becoming bigger and bigger, and they don't know exactly how to curb them, how to change it, Yes, so that's the idea actually of this Varna ashrama system. So everybody is, and actually we forgot the Shudras, which we shouldn't, because they carry the entire society. Without Shudras you cannot go anywhere. We all depend on the Shudras, and the Shudras. A Shudra is most happy if he is engaged and protected, somehow. My guru always says every artist needs a manager, So, because an artist is a Shudra, A Shudra is somebody who is creative, who is, wants to move something with his hands, building, creating, singing, acting, And they're very, if they are protected and if they are sponsored, that's the best position for an artist. If an artist has to become his own business manager, then he doesn't have anymore enough time to be creative. So most successful artists were always, protected. A king said, "Okay, I want to build this city," and he invited any artist, any craftsman, and then you had, the most incredible, pieces of art and constructions that took place, when a king or, a wealthy man, sponsored, artists, then they're super happy, So that's the main position of the Shudras. They need some engagement, They need to be, and that's usually mainly with the Shudras, mainly with the Vaishyas, They will find engagement, but also with the other sections of society, they might be engaged in some form of, work, service, and that's for most people. Most people want to have a job, Most people are trying to find a job, and if you have a job, then you're happy, Nice, Very few people then manage to become, entrepreneurs, CEO, you're starting your own company. That's a Vaishya, A Vaishya has the ability to create his own company, and then he engages, a whole set of people, So this is the natural order of things, actually. And there's a very simple analogy to show how it is actually natural. And that's the analogy of the fire. Have you heard it already? The fire analogy? I'm sure, no? There's, if there's a fire in a room, full of people, different people react differently. A fire breaks out. So most people, they just panic. They're like, and start pushing. So then there are some people who are like, oh my God, this is going to be so expensive. They just see this new curtain they donated for the temple, now it's burning, It's like, oh my God. So, and then there is somebody who's like, okay, everybody calm, this is the exit, follow the green lights, we have this new, Feuertreppe, don't worry, Soon we will install a Feuertreppe here, So, So there's always somebody who has this, natural ability to guide people, to natural inclination also, to help and protect people. And then there is somebody who is, very present-minded, and he's like, I think I should call the fireman, and that's the Brahmin, So like that, this is, it's actually a natural inclination that we all have. And any society, those 4 sections of society will be there. The only question is, or let's say like this, in the 12th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a prediction that in the Kali Yuga, one of the main, you could say, characteristics of the Kali Yuga, our present, iron age of quarrel and hypocrisy, is that each section of society is fighting for dominance against the others, So, and that is visible, that is visible in different ways, either you have a theocracy, like in Iran, or maybe now in Afghanistan, Taliban, theocracy, the mullahs become the kings, or the ayatollahs, and then they expect from everybody they should do what they say, So it's, a tyranny of the head, when the head is without, without discrimination, who has different capacities, who has different, tendencies, different, ideas maybe, they just take over power. Because as we just heard, the traditional Brahmin, they live very simple, They're not actually directly involved and would take the position of the king, The idea is that the head should be cool, should be aloof from everything else. Otherwise you're not neutral. And a very good example for this was also in more recent times, but still, over 2,000 years ago, Chanakya Pandit, Chanakya, very famous logician, in ancient India. Not in Vedic times, not in the times of the Puranas, but Chanakya, he was such a capable Brahmin that he trained a new emperor. He united all of India under this emperor, and he installed him as the new king, and guided him every step of the way. So he basically was the main head and power behind this new government. So he could easily have said to his emperor, build me a palace, in the city, But he was a proper Brahmin, He had installed him, Chandragupta was ruling from Patna. Patna is nowadays in Bihar, in India. Very huge ancient city at that time. Many Greeks, many Chinese went there and visited that city. It was 20 kilometers long, along the banks of the Ganges. Huge city with 5 rivers coming together. And he had an army of loyal women who would protect the emperor, Elephants, I forgot how many elephants are around the palace, So easily Chandragupta, who installed this emperor, could have, gotten a palace for himself, just to give him advice, But no, Chanakya Pandit, he was living outside of the city in a simple hut, So that's a true Brahmin, that's the idea. And then, of course, we have so many dictatorships, when there's the rule of power, just rule of arms. The general, becomes the king, becomes the president, very common in many countries, The general decides, this king is weak, the king is not popular. I could become king, The army likes me, a cool general, he's energetic, he's powerful, he can guide all this army, So for him, it's nice. He's a natural leader, So he just takes his army in front of the temple president, the president's palace, and he says, get out, Happened so many times, In South America, it was the most common way of building a government, in the 70s and 80s, The general just took the army and, obliged, or in Pakistan also, neighboring India, so many generals, became president. And that's, of course, also not balanced, because there is no... then it depends actually how good a kshatriya the person is, There's one good example, actually, where a dictatorship worked really well? You know, maybe? No? Today, yeah, very relevant for today. You don't know? It's a city-state. Close to Thailand. It's Singapore. Singapore was a dictatorship. It was a very poor country, you know. And they had a dictator, Lee Kuan Yew, but he was a very good dictator, you know. He was a kshatriya, but, you know, very heavy rules, you know. If you have some drugs with you, death sentence. That's it. You know, if you steal, you know, heavy, you know, 20, 30 years, you know, you go to jail, you know. You spit in the streets, you know, also, you know, $5,000, you know. So heavy, you know, heavy dictator, but also very fair, you know. So because he had such a strong leadership, he managed to uplift, you know, a very poor country to the wealthiest nation, you know, the wealthiest city-state, you know, of nowadays, basically. Singapore, you know, is super wealthy, super organized, because everywhere there is security, you know. Nobody's afraid to go out at night, you know, with something expensive, because there is virtually no crime, you know, because the state is very strong, you know. So you require a strong state, you know. And even in countries like Iraq, we know that, I've met a few Iraqis, you know, over the years, and all of them said that during Saddam Hussein's reign, it was better. You know, you know, now we have democracy, but it's just a weak government, you know, not really, you know, implementing anything, you know, puppet government, you know. So even Saddam Hussein was very unfair to many people in his country, you know. Thieves, you know, or rebels were very scared of him, you know, because he had his country in his hand, you know. So with Saddam Hussein, there would have been no ISIS, you know, taking over, you know, half your country, you know. But with the current situation in Iraq, ISIS, you know, just, you know, with some jeeps, you know, conquered, you know, big part of Iraq, you know. So like that, if you have a kshatriya without a head, it depends what kind of head he has himself, you know. If he has a good head, you know, if he's some kind of, you know, benign and, you know, enlightened person, it might actually be good for the people, you know. But in any case, it's better to have a kshatriya than to have nobody at the helm, you know. And then, of course, we talked about, you know, money in power, you know, capitalism, you know, when the market rules everything, you know. That's also not ideal, you know. Crony capitalism, you know, very dangerous also, you know. Very few people accumulate a lot of money. Many people become very impoverished, you know. Thousands of people are, you know, exploited, you know. It was very common in, you know, when industrialization became very prominent in England and Europe. It was horrible, you know. It's horrible, you know. You know, all the farmers who used to live in the countryside, you know, moving to the cities, you know, to work in factories, you know, and the horrible conditions, you know, barely any security, you know. And it was actually a German Chancellor, Bismarck, you know, Bismarck with a Pickelhaube. He introduced, you know, then some rules, you know, because it was going out of hand, you know. So he introduced, you know, 40 hours working, you know, you need to do some holidays, you know, some rules, because otherwise, if there's no rules from the king, from the state, the capitalists just exploit the people without discrimination, you know. And it's still happening, you know, in many countries like Bangladesh or Africa, Nigeria, you know, or Vietnam, you know, huge factories, you know, producing all our cloth, you know. If you buy cheap cloth, you know, in Teddy, you know, or somewhere, wie heißt es? TikTok oder irgend sowas. Kick, you know, Kick. TikTok ist eine chinesische App, ja. Die ist auch nicht so gut. Ja, diese ganze, all this cloth that are cheaply, you know, available, they're produced somewhere really cheaply, you know. People are suffering because of that as well. So you could say the greed of the Vaishyas is not straight away visible, you know, how it creates destruction. You know? You could say with the dictator it's more very obvious, you know, a dictator is very violent, angry, you know, it's more the element of anger present, you know, he might, you know, just order, you know, kill these people, you know, persecute them, you know, some form of social, cleansing. But with the Vaishyas, it's not so obvious, They seem very nice, they have a lot of money, they're very friendly, they look very happy, They're having good parties, or are arranging really nice, catwalks in Paris, the newest collection of CNA, But in reality, a lot of people are suffering because of that as well, It's greed, Greed, it takes longer to notice the consequences, Greed is, but actually it's the same, Greed and anger both make you blind, You have no discrimination anymore, no intelligence, and you just do something stupid, In the case of anger, it's very immediate, and then you repent afterwards, In the case of greed, it can take many years, You maybe never repent because you're having a good time, Like that. So that's the idea. And this specific verse now is talking about how the king Swayambhuva Manu was offering his daughter, in marriage to this great sage, So this is considered to be a good match, actually, If the man is, an exalted brahmana, it would be natural for a woman to subordinate and to have some form of admiration for her husband. So the same way a kshatriya, can marry a vaishya, and even, of course, in Kali Yuga, this is not always possible, and we have to rely much more on cooperation, true cooperation and mutual respect. It helps a lot, and that's why in all these traditional texts you will find that if you want to have a harmonic relationship, it's ideal if the man is in some ways superior to the woman. It would be actually it's much easier. In many ways, it's natural. You can see it in many ways. Like you could see women who are very, very successful. Some women are very successful, have very high positions. And let's say there's a company and there's a female boss. It's very unlikely that she will start a relationship with one of the workers. Very unlikely. She wants somebody who is more powerful. She doesn't want But a male, for him it's natural. He might like a secretary. Very common. Because that's the psychology. And sometimes we try to pretend it's all the same, but it's not at all the same. Very different. Completely different psychology. So it's interesting and important to note and to take this into consideration when you start a relationship, if you have an admiration for the other person, and in which direction this admiration is moving. It plays a big role in how a relationship is harmonious or not. But actually, I've read also some traditional descriptions are there that if the woman is more prominent in a relationship with a man, then she should be so prominent that she actually becomes kind of a mother. Then it can work again, It says, But if there's a competition, then it's trouble, But if the man obviously, is looking up to this woman as, to some extent as a mother, that she's, the caretaker, then it can work as well. But of course, that's, not ideal, actually. Okay, maybe there are some questions, some thoughts, some criticism, some corrections, anything. Yes?
Nice class. Very instructive. We can see Prabhupada wanted to create a head in society. That's why he made ISKCON society, Bhaktivedanta society. So how long do you think it will take that we can reach the really perfect Varnashram Dharma?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Because in some places, Srila Prabhupada says, in Kali Yuga, this system can never be reestablished. So that's interesting as well. But in many other places, he actually encourages that that's what we should try to apply. That's what we should try to develop. So it's interesting, So on one hand, he's saying, in Kali Yuga, not possible. So what I can see is that from the different instructions that Srila Prabhupada gave in this connection, to me it seems that it's not really, we cannot expect to develop a varnashrama system everywhere in society, But what certainly we can learn from this ideal is, we can at least very clearly examine society and different social structures, that we have in our society or in society in general, and we can see where there is an imbalance and where there is an ailment, and we can offer guidance. So that's what I see mainly, when I talk to people and preach in general. If you understand this logic, as I was trying to explain, the logic of the Varna Purusha, this cooperation, the different duties, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudras, the equal spread of power, etc. All of this is very much, applicable solutions you can actually, apply. So I think that like we as devotees, we need to be able to, give relevant advice that can be applied, generally. And I think, one part of it would be, analyzing what is going wrong, How is the Varna Purusha ailing, or where there's an imbalance, like that. And of course, globally speaking, my speculation is that, but that's my speculation, that India can play a big role, if India, because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Prabhu's idea was that, who founded the movement 500 years ago, who, started spreading bhakti as we study it, as we understand the Srimad Bhagavatam, he put a strong emphasis, on those who were born in India, actually. He said, if you're born in India, you actually have this culture, it's not so difficult, it's closer to you already. And India should take this knowledge and spread it in the whole world. So that's my speculation personally, that India, it's moving now first towards, trying to catch up with China, just with infrastructure and, and money and weapons and whatnot. But at the same time, India is also in a huge self-finding process, because a big part of India, a big chunk of India actually is very much disenfranchised from their own culture, Many years of, socialistic education, secular education, many years, centuries of colonialism, have created havoc in society. Many people in India have no idea, at all. And there are a few families and areas where people are very much connected to their culture, but the masses of people in India are not really sure, what they want. They're very proud of India, that's for sure. They have a strong sentiment, and that's the good part, because they have a strong sentiment, and this sentiment, if it's channeled towards reappreciating the valuable culture that they have, India, even this is what I was saying in the beginning. I didn't finish talking about it actually. That India's social fabric and cultural fabric, even if people are not educated and don't fully understand, they're still part of it, Like I found one inquiry really interesting. They were asking Indians on the street, what are the main rivers in India? So what are the main rivers in India? Saraswati. So that's the one I was looking for, Saraswati, Because Saraswati, it's not there anymore, The river Saraswati is not present anywhere in India, not really, There are some smaller rivers that are also called Saraswati, but in all ancient texts in India, In the Bhagavatam also, we hear the great sage Vyasa, who wrote this Bhagavatam, he was meditating on the river Saraswati, he was meditating there, big river, And in all the Vedic texts, very ancient Vedic texts, in the Rig Veda, we hear about the Saraswati river, big river, the biggest river in India, but this river is not present in India anywhere, It's not there anymore, So that's very interesting, because when they were going around and making this survey about the rivers of India, most people, even very simple people, most of them counted Saraswati as a river, and most of them didn't even know that since 4,000 years this river has dried up, but it's still in the cultural memory of India, So that's a very good example how even the most, common persons, they hear, River Saraswati, they heard it somewhere, because there's so many religious descriptions about it. But actually this river doesn't exist. And for a long time, this was one of the arguments Indologists, Western Indologists used against the Vedas, and they said, this Vedas, they're talking about this big river, which is nowhere, They're crazy, they're imagining so many gods, and now they're also imagining big rivers, But then, I forgot, it was in the beginning of the 90s, I think, they found, with the satellite imagery, this ancient riverbed, going all the way from the Himalayas to the Gulf of Kutch, in present-day Gujarat, huge riverbed, So the river, and then with a lot of archaeological survey and also study of the texts, they could figure out that actually this river dried up, around 4,000 years ago. Because if you study different texts, you see how some of the descriptions later on, they describe it as being smaller, So it was becoming smaller, it was drying up, until it was finally gone, the Saraswati River. And now it's actually still flowing to some extent. So in some areas, if you drill in this riverbed, it's still water there, flowing underneath. Underground, yeah. So it's still flowing, but not visible anymore as a huge current. But the point is that many people in India, even they haven't, received proper, Gurukul education, they think, one of the rivers is Saraswati, because it's still in the cultural memory, So, like that, India is a civilization, and Prabhupada used to say that the Vedic civilization of India is like an elephant, It's always worth 1 lakh rupees, Probably nowadays 1 lakh is not very much, Probably usually 1 crore rupees, maybe, I don't know, to buy an elephant. But a living elephant or a dead elephant is always worth the same, Because alive, it's a very powerful, intelligent animal, it can do a lot, It's an expensive pet you can keep at home, But if the elephant is dead, it's still valuable, because of the ivory, the leather, So a dead or living elephant, always same value. And this analogy he gave in connection to Vedic culture, that Vedic culture is always valuable, Even it's not nowadays, a living, it's not the state religion of India, but still it's there, It's in one sense you could say it's dead, but in the case of Vedic tradition, it's still alive actually, it's still valuable, In many places you can still benefit, from its knowledge, from its tradition. The paramparas, the lineages, of knowledge are still there, So it's not completely gone, We can still derive benefit from it. And actually it's very unique, and we forget about it sometimes. Like when you go to India, in many places, it is still like if you would go to Rome, in Italy, and you would still see the temple of Jupiter, and people running around with Roman robes, Doesn't happen, of course, You only see the ruins. So in India, in many places, you don't see the ruins anymore because they reuse it and the monsoon wash it away, centuries ago. But the people, are still doing the same things. They're still dressing, traditional fabrics since thousands of years. So in many ways, India is kind of like one of the few places in the world, and to that scale, for sure, the only one where you can look very, very, very far into the past. It's a living civilization still. So that's why my hope is that, this civilization, will wake up again. And India is the underdog. Everybody underestimates India. They all think India, I don't know, they're just, charming snakes, slums, they're so poor, my God, big problem, so many people, So they completely underestimate India, but India is incredibly powerful, even materially speaking, Out of the last 2 years, out of the 30 unicorn companies that were founded in the world, most of them were from India. So it's only a question of time. You don't have any more iPhone from America, and TikTok from China, but something from India. And anyway, all of this is only running because of software. India is supplying software to all of those companies. IBM, is absolutely dependent on Indian software engineering. They couldn't function without it anymore. So this is the power of, you could say the soft power of India, its culture, its civilization, its knowledge, And my prediction is that India will become predominant more and more materially, but then also spiritually, can become a guiding light, and make, with this knowledge about how to, create social justice in society, because it's technically very simple, small, hints that need to be given, but they need to come from the right source, with enough audience and with, with enough credibility, We can talk about it a lot, and it's good, and people will hear us to some extent, social media, and we should practice it. But if you want to have a, global, impact, then we need to have some global leaders as well talking about it, And of course, you can expect that only from India, It's already the most populous country in the world, and the Prime Minister congratulates everyone for Janmashtami, and he shows pictures of ISKCON temples and the paintings of Jadurani Mataji, direct disciple of Srila Prabhupada. So that's big, we should not underestimate India, the influence India has. First within India, and only a question of time globally as well. Okay, anything else? Some doubts? It's already late, Yeah.
Saraswati is mentioned also in the prayer. Saraswati Devi as a goddess of learning.
Yeah.
Not only as a river, but she's also mentioned. She's worshipped as a goddess of learning.
Yeah. Yeah, Ganga, the thing is, we understand that nothing is impersonal, So the planet, is not just a planet, ultimately it's an entity, it's a living entity, Mother Earth, Bhudevi, In the same way Ganga, it's a river, but actually Ganga Devi is a personality as well, a divinity. And the same for Saraswati. Yeah, Saraswati, she's the goddess of learning, Sharda Pit, there's a few famous temples for Saraswati. Keshava Kashmiri, who argued with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, was a great devotee of Saraswati. And he came from Kashmir, Sharda Pit, very famous temple. Nowadays it's in Pakistan. Okay, we'll close here. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.